Well, when you think about schizophrenia, there are really two things initially that, two myths that you want to dispel. And the first myth is the idea that schizophrenia involves split personalities, right? I think that we've all heard of this. The idea that someone might alternate between one personality and then shift to another personality, and somehow that this represents schizophrenia. This common misconception, I think, comes from the actual label of the disorder. So schizophrenia, literally, schizo means split, and phrenia means mind. So I think that has led people to the idea that that the disorder might consist of multiple personalities. I want to be clear that that's not at all what the diagnosis of schizophrenia represents, but instead, the idea of schizophrenia came down to us from the Swiss psychiatrist by the name of Eugene Bleuler. Bleuler used the term schizophrenia to describe a splitting of perception on the one hand and thinking on the other. So it wasn't a disruption in personality per se, but rather a breakdown in specific mental processes. And that's the way that Bleuler had defined it. But I think because of those words, it's frequently been thought of as being a disorder involving split personalities. The other common misconception is that people with schizophrenia are highly violent. And I think this view has come down from some very widely publicized cases. So there have been some very public acts of murder in the past 10 to 15 years. In the U.S., we can think of the Gabby Giffords shooting in 2011, 2012, the Aurora, Colorado movie theater attack. And in both cases, the people who performed those attacks had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And I think this has led us to come to the conclusion that people with schizophrenia are more violent than the average population. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, current studies indicate that the rates of violence among people with schizophrenia just might be slightly elevated relative to the general population. And there was a recent study by the MacArthur Foundation for Understanding Risk that in fact found that other psychiatric diagnoses that are thought to be less serious than schizophrenia, such as depression, may actually have slightly higher rates of violence than in people with schizophrenia. The other key element to understand about schizophrenia and violence is that people with schizophrenia are much more likely to be the victims of violence rather than the perpetrators. And this is because they often do not have a lot of money, they are often unable to work, and they often end up living in neighborhoods that might be more dangerous. And their cognitive difficulties and their symptoms may make them more vulnerable to predators in their home environment. The findings are particularly notable in that our treatment for schizophrenia has changed so rapidly over those 100 years. So in the first 20 to 30 years, schizophrenia was treated largely through what's been called the fresh air treatment. The fresh air treatment came over to us from Enlightenment ideals from Western Europe. And both in America and in Western Europe in the early 1900s, it was thought that it was best to treat people with schizophrenia with basically beautiful, relaxing environments, bucolic scenes where they could walk around in sort of relaxed settings and become better. And this was referred to as the fresh air treatment. In the 30s, 40s, and 50s, you begin to see the institutionalization of many very aggressive forms of somatic therapy. These included methods such as psychosurgery, where actually parts of the brain were cut out. And this also involved treatments such as inducing seizures, right? Insulin coma therapy was one of the common approaches. So inducing comas or seizures was another approach to treating the disorder in the 50s. And then you go up to the 70s and 80s with the advent of the antipsychotic medications. These are oral antipsychotic medications. And while they have undoubtedly had very profound effects on the management of symptoms in the disorder, outcome remains impaired even with the emergence of that treatment. So part of the course will be looking at this discrepancy between, on the one hand, all these very powerful and fascinating advancements in our scientific understanding of schizophrenia versus, on the other hand, our treatment data, which suggests that many people with schizophrenia continue to have poor outcomes, and why there might be this discrepancy. The other key thing to understand about, other key element to understand about schizophrenia and violence is that people with schizophrenia are much more likely to be the victims of violence rather than the perpetrators. And this is because they often do not have a lot of money, they're often unable to work, and they often end up living in neighborhoods that might be more dangerous. And their cognitive difficulties and their symptoms may make them more vulnerable to predators in their home environment.